Thank you. Thanks for coming. Tonight, I'm going to talk about, obviously, as we see the relationship between weight and sleep. I'm going to tell a little story to start us off tonight. I've been doing this now for 13 years full time. And someone in the first about 2 years, this guy is still very vivid to me, the conversations we had about his weight and his sleep. And so, if we take the three big things that go into weight loss. So diet, we all come in here, okay, diet. There's exercise and there's sleep. And he was losing weight, unfortunately, like guys often do. It's fast. And he got to a point where he's just about to go into maintenance. And then we picked up on this sleep thing. And so, to give you a little story, he worked for a company that was based in Europe. And he was a manager. So he had weird conference calls. 2 in the morning, 5 in the morning. So there were nights where he only slept just a few hours. And we noticed that if he was on his diet and he was exercising, but not sleeping, his weight actually maintained. And then there would be times where 2 or 3 weeks he didn't have conference calls. And so he was back to sleep. He was always an exerciser. That was his thing. But his diet could soften up a little bit. And what did he do? He maintained. And so if he had 2 of the 3 big things, so he had 3 of the 3, he was losing weight. 2 of the 3, and we found out about either 2 of the 3 or any 2 of the 3, he lost slowly, maintained. If we only had 1 of them, so his diet went off a little bit, and now he isn't sleeping because he has conference calls, he's slowly gaining. And then if he had none of the 3, you're fast gaining. Now the fast gaining I've picked up now since then, but we really looked very closely at all 3 of those variables in him, and I said, there's got to be something with sleep. And this is back, 2006, 7, or 8, somewhere in that range. There wasn't a lot published about sleep and weight. We didn't know a lot about the hormones and everything else. So I said, there's got to be something more there. And so I started being aware. Every time I saw a medical journal publish something to do with sleep and weight, sleep and health, here I am reading at least the summary. And I get an email every day of the top things in the news. And I can tell you at least once every 3 weeks, sometimes every 2 weeks, there's something about sleep and health. And this has been for the last years. And I've started keeping all these things. And now we know. And if anyone, their first time in, wasn't sleeping at least 7 hours, I probably told you 3 statistics. Number 1, very simply, if you're sleeping less than 7 hours, we're more likely to be overweight. If you're sleeping more than 7 hours, you're less likely to be. They did a study, it was done initially on women, but it was if they were sleeping 5 hours, they went around all the 5-hour sleepers, and they said, how many of them are overweight? And it was 80%. 80%. Oh my gosh, what's going on? So we're going to learn about that. And then the last one, and we will talk about this study a little bit, is they took people who were sleeping 8.5 hours and compared their metabolism to people sleeping 5.5 hours, which is all too common in our world, not just in a clinic like this, but in our world. And their metabolism fell by 400 calories a day. And so you try to do the things you want to do. You go on a diet, you start exercising, and you don't see the results you're looking for. Number 1, I see in the clinic is sleep, and that's why I talk about sleep incessantly. So that is kind of what got me interested in this sleep thing. And I've been asking for about 2 years at my society, I want to give a talk on sleep, and finally I touched the right person at the right time, and they said, do it. And so in January or December of this year, they said, we're going to do it, and it's next week. And so I started putting this talk together. So that's kind of why I've been so interested in sleep as a topic in this. So tonight we're going to talk about the why of sleep. Why do we need to sleep? And it is not just weight, it is health. I started talking about this with some people in the office, and I was going to title this subsection, why do I need to waste 8 hours a day sleeping? And I said that to the right person. They go, that's not waste. I like sleeping. So I didn't say that wasn't the right topic to do. And I don't think it's waste. So I didn't want to even put that at all into this thing. So that's why should we sleep? The second is there are some major sleep disorders that we see that make it hard for people to sleep. Sleep apnea being number 1, and restless leg syndrome being number 2. And they're both treatable conditions. And number 3, you can't leave one of my talks without learning something you can do tomorrow. So we talk a little bit about sleep and how to sleep better. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'm going to hit a lot of topics. Some of them about medicines, some about things you can do at bedtime regarding lights and sounds, and a lot of things I talk about daily, some about the medicines, and so forth. So that's what we're going to accomplish. So what's happening in the US? American adults who were sleeping 8 hours back in 1998, so this is now 20 years ago, 35%, so 1 out of every 3. Not great. 2005, only 1 out of 4, 26%. We're 2019, do you think it's less? Absolutely. Here's another statistic. So the average duration, so that was just how many are hitting 8 hours of sleep. So average duration back in 1960. So 1960, remember, I grew up in Chicago. We had how many television channels? 2, 5, 7, 9, 11, 32, 44, 60 something. We had 8 TV channels. How many TV channels do you have now? There's always something on. You can stream it at any time, day or night. We have those computers in our pockets. So 1960, when they were sleeping 8 or 9 hours, we didn't have any of that stuff. 1995, 7 hours, we still didn't. What year did the iPhone come out?
2008.
2007. Yeah. Netflix streaming, what year did it come out? 2007. Absolutely. And so now it's everywhere, and unlimited data, unlimited everything else. I mean, people are tied to their screens, and screen time and time away from sleep is costing us health. Japan, it was better than us, or maybe, because we said 8 to 9, they were 8:13, and then 7:32 in 1995. Again, still, they have the same technology we have, so it's getting worse. So what's happening? So if we take insufficient sleep as the base, there's something called homeostatic feeding behavior. So the upregulation of appetite-stimulating hormones, the things I talk about all the time that's going on in the brain. We get more hungry when we're not sleeping. So there's hunger goes up. Non-homeostatic, not regulation. So the rewarding value of food. Foods that have fat and sugar and salt look better and taste better to us when we're sleep deprived, and we want them more than a salad all the time, not just sometimes. So energy intake goes up, leading to what? Fat gain. Physical activity, most likely, there's a question mark, but most likely when you're tired, you're going to give up the gym more often than not. And therefore, and increasing fatigue, less energy expenditure, leading again to more fat gain. So all roads leading to really these two things. Why don't we sleep? So this was an interesting study. It was a questionnaire. It was given to people, and it asked them 2 questions. How much psychological distress do you have? And that was really defined as kind of 3 things. How much anxiety, how much depression, and how much just overall stress over your ordinary do you have? And people rated it themselves. It's a lot. So excellent, very good, and so forth down the road. And then your self-perceived health status. They didn't go and talk to your doctor, didn't have you list all your medical things. Again, do you have excellent health, very good health, and so forth. And what they looked at when they saw that is if you put down you have excellent or very good health, and you have low distress, you actually slept. So only 5% of all the people slept less than 6 hours. Another 20% slept 6 to 7 hours. So if you said you had low psychological distress and pretty good health, 75% of those people are actually sleeping 7 or more hours. There was one, call it exception, there's always an exception to the rule, people who exercise a lot. And so they said if you had vigorous leisure activity, that was 7 hours or more per week, or 3 or more strength training sessions per week, which is both associated with sleep less than 6 hours. I think of that as the Ironman triathletes. We all know Ironman triathletes in our vicinity. They're doing roughly 4 hours of exercise most days training. And you have to ask, is that healthy? I have personal biases. It may not be healthy. We haven't truly proven it, but it's a lot of exercise, and they're losing out on sleep. This is an interesting one. So someone was trying to come up, what is the function of sleep? We talked about it. It takes short-term memory and translates it into long-term memory. It's almost like refiling when we used to have computers that defragmented. You'd have to set it, and 3 hours later you'd come back and it would be all easier to use. They would be faster. We don't do that anymore. But when we do that, that's kind of what our brains are doing at night. So this doctor, I don't know if he's a doctor, but Daniel Gartenberg is a researcher at Pennsylvania State. He said we need 8.5 hours a night to do this process that he described as synaptic homeostasis. So all the synapses, all the brain connections, they rewire just a little bit every single night. And we have a lot of information coming into our brains. We're bombarded with information from the modern world. In computer terms, said we have 34 gigabytes of information coming into our brains every day, from internet, from work, from everything, and it takes time every night to file that away. And so if we say, yeah, my memory's not good for that thing, the less sleep we get, the more true that's going to be. We have to be able to sleep to take short-term memories and make them long-term memories. So there are functions to sleep that are necessary. So let's talk about health, not just weight. But number one on the list here is weight. Insufficient sleep is associated with weight. Type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, abnormal immune function, which may be, if you take it a step further, cancer related. Because our immune system has changed with cancers that grow out of control. And then, unfortunately, premature death, the end all of not being healthy. If we get specific about endocrine manifestations, decreased glucose tolerance leading to diabetes, decreased insulin sensitivity, again towards diabetes and such, increased evening cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone, so more stressful on our body. Increased ghrelin and leptin. I talk about leptin and ghrelin all the time. I talk about it again in a couple slides, but those are hunger hormones. I'll say it a few times. We want leptin to be high. It tells our body we're full. We want ghrelin to be low. It tells us we're not hungry. And right before a meal, the ghrelin comes from the stomach. It comes up. We eat our meal and it goes back down. And leptin comes from our fat. So it kind of does, as we lose a significant amount of weight, it does come down also. And therefore leading to increased hunger and appetite. So we can measure many of these hormones in the body. Sleep facts. Let's talk about kids. Kids are, the next generation is going to be, they've said, is now going to live shorter than the current generations because of weight and diabetes and diseases like that. Kids who sleep less than 10 hours, are 89% greater risk than their peers to have obesity. I started to try to do the math of that. You know, my kids go to bed at 9 o'clock. What time do they have to wake up? And no, the kids are not sleeping enough. School starts probably too early, and we've known that for years. It just isn't changing anytime soon. Adults sleeping less than 5 hours. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm sure there are people in this room that often sleep, if not all the time, sleep less than 5 hours. 55% more likely to have obesity than those sleeping greater than 5 hours. Just that. It's not what you're eating. I mean, that comes into it. It's not what we're exercising. It's just sleep related. A reduction of 1 hour of sleep is associated with a 0.35 increase in BMI points. And less sleep over that, more. Morning types have lower BMI than evening types. Luckily, I am probably the #1 most morning type person in this room. I have never in my life slept past 9 a.m. ever. I'm up on my own between 5 and 6. It's just me. I didn't do anything to do it. But so many people are evening types. And most of the time that's probably somewhat genetically determined or is habitually determined regarding work and all those other things. Late sleepers ate 248 more calories per day on average, mostly from dinner and after. And that has part to do with hormones and the hormones that change throughout the day, and also to do with our circadian rhythms and when our body should be awake versus asleep. And food, beyond daylight, beyond when we typically go to sleep, food helps reset circadian rhythms. So if we're feeding ourselves at different times, it sets the whole cycle off. This is a reference. I'm going to talk a lot about when I talk to the doctors and everyone next week, but New England Journal of Medicine 2011 is this article here. It's called The Long-Term Persistence of Hormonal Adaptations to Weight Loss. This is, in my world, it's called the Sumithran article. He's the main author. And it's what, for me, changed weight from a personal problem to a medical condition. This is the one that says, with leptin and ghrelin, we want leptin to be high and ghrelin to be low. And when you lose weight, they begin to do this. The more weight you lose, the leptin comes down because we've lost fat, and the ghrelin comes up all the time more. Starts at a higher level, goes to potentially a higher level. And so that's where you said, in the beginning of my program, I was able to not eat certain foods even when they were around. But a little bit later, that looked a little good, and that looked a little good. It isn't a willpower thing. It's the hormones inside of us saying, eat, eat. And so what happens is that either changes our hormones so that we slowly regain weight and they tend to go back to normal, or we've studied them for a year and they don't go back to normal. They don't reset. There's always that little voice saying, eat. And so that's why we have to do techniques that counteract those hormones, including, as we do here, higher protein diets, less carbohydrate diets, medications, sleep, exercise that makes us feel good. And some combination of that is what works for most of us. So using that is why these things happen. Let's talk about leptin, because leptin's now been studied a lot regarding sleep. 2 nights of 4 hours of sleep. We use 7 or 8 hours as our baseline. In this study, it was 8 hours. Instead of 10 hours, 18% decrease in circulating leptin. Leptin, again, is telling us our body is working fine. Metabolism stays high, hunger stays, or you stay satiated longer, full longer. A 28% increase in ghrelin, more hunger. Just from 2 nights, decreased to 4 hours. Increased hunger and appetite is what we get. And leptin also decreases with fasting. So this whole big push with intermittent fasting, I still think the jury is out. Because what's happening is our metabolism is falling. Our muscle mass may be coming down. Our body's doing things to slow our metabolism with less leptin. And inflammation. Stress causing inflammation, lack of sleep causing inflammation, and other medical conditions that are not related to weight or anything causing inflammation can all be related to this. Leptin should be extra or goes up during sleep. Since the time we haven't eaten, it's higher during sleep. It's decreased with sleep restriction, 19% versus extending sleep or sleeping longer than normal. It's inhibited via the sympathetic nervous system. That's the nervous system, that's the fight or flight. So when we have stress, this is decreased. And it mirrors, so the opposite of cortisol. Cortisol high, leptin low. So that's stress goes high, what? Fullness goes down. We all know that. When I'm stressed out, I eat more food. It makes sense, but we've studied it in blood, in humans. There's a lot of details here because I think it's important to this is the point that I want to make. 6 days of 4 hours of sleep decreased leptin levels by 26%. 2 days versus extending it, so going an extra 4 hours, leptin decreased 18%, ghrelin decreased 28%, and then again, hunger increases proportionately about 24%. Appetite went up 23%. 3 days, so this goes back to, again, I think cutting calories too much or intermittent fasting. 3 days of 70% calorie intake, so they cut about 900 calories a day out, decreased leptin by 22% in this study. Why does leptin go down when we're fasting and such? So it's probably because the body's going to say, I'm going to need more calories. I don't know where they're going to come from, so if I slow your metabolism down, the ones I have are going to last longer. That's kind of what we say that it's saying here. Graphs. So let me orient you. First, 4 hours of sleep versus 12 hours of sleep. So one is too short, one potentially longer, but maybe even too long, which we'll get to. Leptin, the hormone we're talking about, if you just look at numbers, it's lower versus higher. That's the first thing to take away from it. The time that they were asleep is this little black line in both of them. You can see the short period, short sleep, long sleep. This is the peak leptin. It's not even happening during sleep is when it should happen. Here, it's happening a little differently, but it is happening actually during sleep, which is good. Cortisol, our stress hormone, during sleep, right here, the curve leading up and after it is different in these two. This is the better state, that being the worst state when you look at cortisol. So what are the benefits of sleeping 6 to 8 hours? If I say, okay, we're going to start establishing that is the window. 6 hours on the low side, or really it's 7 hours on the low side, 9 hours on the high side. But this looked at better mood, better ability to focus. That's that memory thing working better again. Decrease in daytime sleepiness, people falling asleep at the wheel. Night shift workers, happen to a lot of them, falling asleep at the wheel. More willingness to exercise, helps burn more calories. A decrease, therefore, in caffeine intake, that makes sense. And less cravings, as I talked about a few minutes ago, for sweet and salty foods, especially in the evening. The time we probably shouldn't be having more food. If you kind of turn that pyramid upside down, big meal for breakfast, medium meal for lunch and smaller meal for dinner, like the American upside downness, or we're really, really upside down, meaning our biggest meals come from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. in many people. Lower risk of cardiovascular events and death by sleeping. I wanted to emphasize it. This is health. We come here and we do this weight loss for health. And so one of the major things before you even start dieting, exercise, is sleep. So does sleep help fat loss? Yes. So similar weight loss. So interesting. So two people eating the same foods, doing the same exercise, one sleeping 8.5 hours, the other sleeping 5.5 hours. Only 25% of the weight loss when you were sleeping shorter was fat. So your fat loss went down, your muscle loss went up. Fat went down by 55% less fat loss than the person sleeping 8.5 hours. Free fat mass loss, which is for all intents and purposes muscle when we talk about it here, it increased by 60%. 60% increased muscle loss, even though we were losing weight. So the scale looked the same, but inside of us, we weren't as healthy. 5.5 hours, the shorter sleep also showed, as we talked about, ghrelin, lower resting metabolic rate. So our metabolism slowed down. And here's where I talk about 920 calories versus 520 calories. That's 400 calories less. If you want to do something else with this 400 calories, you want to walk 400 calories worth, how far are you going to walk? Do we just play this game?
Yes.
So 1 mile is 100 calories. The average person takes 20 minutes to walk it. This is an hour and 20 minutes of walking. Or sleep. I actually like exercise, but if the choice is that I'm going to go out and do an hour and 20 minutes or I'm going to sleep a little bit more, let's sleep a little bit more first, and then we'll feel better and we'll want to do the exercise more. This is an interesting graph, and I'm also going to spend a minute to take you through. Respiratory quotient is numbers that you can do through a breathing test, and it will tell you how much fat you're burning versus carbohydrate. What you want, if you're burning all fat, you're at 0.7, so that is at the bottom here. And if you're burning all carbohydrate, you're up at 1. And so the higher you go, the less fat you're burning. And here we have people sleeping 8.5 hours are white, so they're burning more fat. This is before the meal. An hour after, because of what's in the meal, you're going to burn a little more carbohydrate. And as that gets used and your body starts drawing on your own fat stores again, your fat burning goes up. Well, look at this. Same thing, same person, just not sleeping 3 hours less. This is all I'm talking about is 3 hours less. For every point down there, they are burning less fat. Make sense? So let's change. We're going to change from overall sleep to diabetes, because diabetes is correlated, as we'll see, very strongly. The incidence of type 2 diabetes in the U.S., 760 people for every 100,000 in the U.S. right now. And a whole bunch of them that have pre-diabetes before that. 68 cases of diabetes for every 100. Increase for every 1 hour reduction of less than 7 hours. So that's 9% extra people because they're not getting sleep. Compare that to 7 hours at the bottom here. An hour decrease increased type 2 diabetes by almost 10%, 9%. An hour increase over normal. So as we'll go back to, there's a window. You want to go below that, it's not healthy. And if you go over 9, it's not as healthy either. Sleep restriction gives insulin resistance in human adipocytes. Adipocytes are human fat cells. So the cell itself is showing insulin resistance. They're the key site of insulin action, energy metabolism, and then the fat cells are sending signals to the brain. They're telling the body what to do. And if they're saying I'm insulin resistance, it's send more sugar my way because I don't have the sugar I need. In vivo, 30% decrease in cellular insulin sensitivity after 4 nights less sleep. That's all it takes. 4 nights less sleep, and we're seeing difference. With sleep restriction, and this will go on to the next slide, REM sleep, our dreaming stage, was reduced by 56.8%. Wow. Let's talk about melatonin. I think this is super early stuff, but lower melatonin secretion was independently associated with type 2 diabetes. So less dreaming stage, less deep sleep, less melatonin naturally. In several studies, they looked at SNPs. SNPs are little genetic tests you can do to look at specific markers in the blood, and you can find errors in the genetics. So there's something wrong with these type B melatonin receptors. And if you found these abnormalities, so the melatonin wasn't working exactly like other people's, we had higher fasting sugar, diabetes or prediabetes, higher hemoglobin A1C, what we do to measure diabetes over a 3-month period, and then increased incidence of gestational. So even gestational, we're going to say those are even younger people because their pregnancy age, and type 2 diabetes. Men who reported sleeping less than 5 hours, 2 times more likely to develop diabetes than sleeping over 7 hours. That's so that 2 times more. It's a lot. Now this last 2 pieces I just thought were interesting. We haven't done any human studies, so these are rats and mice. Rats and mice are not small humans. But they say if it works there, we should study these things in humans. Rats are awake at night and asleep during the day, and we're the exact opposite. They eat for many, many different reasons than we do. But anyway, giving them melatonin protected them from diabetes, who were diabetes prone, and from developing hyperlipidemia, hyperglycemia, and hyperleptinemia. In insulin-resistant mice, it reversed their insulin resistance. I don't know if it helped them sleep better or what. It is mice, we can't ask them the questions. But I think this should lead to someone doing pilot studies on humans, and that. I wasn't able to find anything on that, so I don't know. This is a curve talking about relative risk of type 2 diabetes. A 1 risk is your base standard risk. You're the same. As you go up, 10% increase, 20 and 30, 40. 2 would be a double the risk. This dark line is the average population with error bars on each side. And you can see here, about 7 hours, 7 3/4 hours is the least amount of risk. We call this a U curve. So if you go too far this side, if you're at 7.5 and you sleep less, your risk of diabetes goes up. If you're at 7.5 hours and you go up much more, you're sleeping 10 hours a night, it's as bad as potentially sleeping 6 hours a night. We don't know exactly why that is, by the way. Sometimes people who have other health conditions that they sleep longer, or they have sleep apnea, and they're not getting quality sleep during that time and such, are in bed longer because they aren't getting the sleep, or other health conditions. We don't know exactly. Let's switch gears. We're getting into the 2 diseases that I mentioned briefly. So the first one is obstructive sleep apnea. Every time I talk to someone about obstructive sleep apnea, this is the picture that pops in their head. This is the picture that should pop in our head, right? Right? It's not this one. It should be this one. It's good to have a CPAP mask. So what is sleep apnea? It's a temporary stop or decrease in breathing during sleep. An apnea is actually stopping breathing, so complete stoppage of breathing. Hypopnea, so not complete, but a partial obstruction of oxygen flow. Your desaturations, if you're checking saturations, go down by at least 3%. It lasts about a minimum of 10 seconds when they're measuring it. And a positive test, you're having 15 or more per hour. So they have a thing called AHI, Apnea Hypopnea Index. And that's you take your apneas and your hypopneas, you add them together, and it gives you a number per hour. And so once you hit 15, you have it, unless you have a lot of other health concerns, and then we're more sensitive, so even 5 an hour can be it. Predictive, loud snoring, the number one best thing. People say, yes, loud snoring, and I ask, does anyone hear you stop breathing? I ask that one every single time we talk about snoring. Gasping, just being overweight, as we'll talk about the statistics regarding it. And then an increased neck circumference, more tissue in our neck. And the higher we go, the more likely. It starts at about 15.5, probably increased risk, and 16 and 16.5 and 17 and 18 and 19, the higher the risk. But that's where we kind of start risk. Test is called a nocturnal polysomnography, so a sleep study. Can be done in a sleep lab or done at home. sometimes we'll try to do and get it all done and call it in one night. If we really think you have sleep apnea, the first part of the night you do the regular test, and after about 2 hours, if they notice your number of apnea hypopneas are at least 20, they'll say, okay, you do have sleep apnea, and the second half of the night they'll actually work on fitting the maps to you and seeing how much pressure and such that you need. The home tests, which unfortunately a lot of insurances are mandating as your first step, are not as accurate. They can more often rule it in, but they're not good at ruling it out. But a lot of times it is easier to do a home test, something on your hand, and I think there's one electrode and you sleep in your own bed and everything else. Where a sleep study, my son did have a sleep study when he was 6, and I went with him to the lab, and yes, there's a lot of things on, and you're sleeping in a room that looks like a hotel room, and it is somewhat harder to sleep, but trust me, if you have sleep apnea, it is worth doing the test. Or if we think you have sleep apnea, it's worth doing the test. Home testing is not indicated with a few conditions: congestive heart failure, chronic lung disease, or other some neurologic conditions with a lot of movement and such. If you're sleeping on your back supine versus on your side laterally, sleeping on your back doubles your snoring and your hypopnea index. For a while we talked about getting a t-shirt and sewing tennis balls in the back. And it would keep you, every time you'd roll your back, it would press on your back so you'd roll back to your side. I don't know if those were even available, but we talked about that years and years ago. Other treatments besides continuous pressure mask, a mandibular advancement device, a jaw positioning device, and there's a bunch of different ones. There's certain dentists in town and certain specialists who make those for you. Something called the UPPP. UPPP is basically where they take out your palate and the little thing. Remember what the little thing's called? Thank you. Did you ever see that Far Side years ago? It's like final exam, or it's like bonus question on your medical school test. What was the little thing called in the back? Neurostimulation to the hypoglossal nerve, which helps tighten up the loose muscles. I have not actually seen that one work, or not work. I haven't seen it used, but it is available. The Stop Bang questionnaire. So this is probably the best of the questions to say when you screen someone, do I think they have sleep apnea? Is it worth going on to the next stage and getting a sleep study? And so STOP Bang are the 8 questions. The first one is, do you snore loudly? Yes or no? Tired. Do you feel fatigued, tired, or sleepy during the daytime? Trouble staying asleep. Observe apnea. Has anyone heard that you gasp or wheeze while you're sleeping? High blood pressure. Or are you treated for high blood pressure? BMI is your body mass index more than 35. So what we'll call class 2 obesity. Are you older than 50? Is your neck greater than 15.75? Men know that because of shirt size. We have rulers if we want, or measuring, we can measure other people. And are you a male? If you have 0 to 2, you're at low risk. 3 to 4, you're at medium risk. And if you have greater than 5, you have high risk. How many?
Hit them all.
Okay. The elbow sign. Have I told any of you guys about the elbow sign? So I was looking for a picture. What is the elbow sign? It's not this. This is what I said was the elbow sign. But it's actually being elbowed by the person you share your bed with.
Oh.
And it's like, wake up, wake up. If you have sleep apnea, it's seen in 97% of people that have sleep apnea at some time or another. It may not be an every night occurrence, but at some point they're like, I wanted to make sure you were still breathing, is what I hear all the time. In the US, so let's talk about it. Is it popular? Absolutely. 24 to 25% of all men in the US have sleep apnea. 9% of women. If you have severe obesity, 93% of all men. We call that thing shooting fish in a barrel. 93.6% says you have sleep apnea. 73, so 3 out of every 4 women. What does sleep apnea make worse? What health conditions? Hypertension, I've underlined that 2 or 3 times. Every time I see someone who's on 3 or 4 or 5 blood pressure medicines, the first thing I think about is sleep apnea and hard to control. Congestive heart failure, atrial fibrillation, stressing the heart, diabetes, and pulmonary hypertension. Just not breathing, loading the heart at night. This was the odds of having a condition and we'll talk about these conditions, plus obstructive sleep apnea versus just having obstructive sleep apnea. So it runs together. Atrial fibrillation, a 4-time odds. Depression, 2.6 times. Congestive heart failure, stroke, hypertension, coronary artery disease, and diabetes. All these things that run with not sleeping well. So if you gain 10% of your weight from wherever you are today, your apnea-hypopnea index increases by 30%. And you get a 6 times increase in moderate and severe obstructive sleep apnea. If you have a 10% loss, 26% decrease. And the numbers that you can hear, people getting like an AHI of 60 is 1 time every minute. An AHI of 90 is 45 seconds or so. But 120 would be every 30 seconds they're having an apnea. And that is those are possible results. Shaking, yeah, yes. So let's tie it back to leptin. Let's tie it back to these hormones. Leptin levels are elevated in sleep apnea. Plasma leptin was 50% higher in patients with sleep apnea than matched controls. But what we found there is leptin in these people especially, it's independent of the amount of weight they have because leptin is made by our fat cells. So what they're saying is there's a resistance to the leptin that they have. So with leptin, we want our metabolism to be good and fullness, but we're resistant to that, but we may not be resistant to the sympathetic drive, what it's doing to our body as far as stress is concerned. 2 days of CPAP, just being on treatment for 2 days decreases ghrelin levels, decreases hunger. We don't see a change in leptin, adiponectin, which is another protective hormone, or resistant. So I wanted to be 100% complete. You can't paint a picture of just goodness with everything. And so there was an increase in insulin and insulin resistance, but it was proportional to the BMI. So there was a small, and we'll talk about how much, a small increased weight when people went on CPAP. But their health, I say that time and time again, their health overall improved. Ghrelin was inversely correlated with insulin resistance. So when the ghrelin went down, the insulin resistance went up, but didn't change with the weight. So now let's officially answer the question. Does CPAP increase weight? And the answer is yes. It promotes a very small BMI and weight increase via a lot of changes. It was 0.5 kilos. So that's about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds on average in the study. Now it was interesting. So we got this from a study of 25 studies all lumped together to make up only 3,000 patients, which in the medical world is not a big study. None of these studies actually looked at what people were eating, nor what they were doing for exercise. So you have to control for these things. One person may be eating more, one person may be eating less. It was across the board, not controlled for. So yes, we can say that people are healthier, but you may not lose weight by treating your sleep apnea. 1 unit less BMI gives you 2.3 less than apnea-hypopnea index. So that's how many times per hour less. Massive weight loss. If you lost 17.9 BMI points, you lost 38.2 points on your apnea-hypopnea index, but only 4% had resolution of their sleep apnea. I did have a gentleman that we had restudied, so he weighed about 270 pounds with sleep apnea. He lost 70 pounds and went on to get restudied. He did resolve his sleep apnea, and when his weight went back up, unfortunately, he did go back on CPAP and such. Most people I have who lose that amount of weight with sleep apnea don't want to have studies again. Nowadays, the newer and newer machines self-titrate. So if you needed a lot of pressure in the beginning, the machines will bring the pressure down as you need less pressure also. So there's less and less reasons to potentially be restudied. CPAP treatment. So here, health benefits. Reduces daytime sleepiness. Improves quality of life. Lowers blood pressure. Reduces visceral fat. So overall weight didn't change, but again, visceral fat, the unhealthy fat, the one that wraps around their organs, did go down. And improved glycemic control and insulin sensitivity. So we did get healthier by going on CPAP. How is it connected to blood pressure? When you have sleep apnea, your blood pressure should go down while you're sleeping, and sympathetic activity, the amount of muscle activation, stress during the day should go down during sleep. and it did not. This was secondary to apnea, so stopping breathing. Hypoxia, your oxygen levels falling during this apnea. Hypercapnia, which is your carbon dioxide levels going up. And then breathing against a closed glottis. So if you try to tighten your throat and breathe in, that happens during the apnea. And then being awakened during the middle of the night. Blood pressure in this study maxed out during sleep, 240 over 130. If anyone is in the office with a 240 over 130, you are directly being driven to the emergency room. This is a hypertensive emergency. And it's happening to people while they sleep all the time. Sympathetic activity increased 125%. This is versus being awake. This is why you should be sleeping and resting. O2 saturations when you were on CPAP went up by 20%. And it was never less than 90%. So CPAP helps. Oxygen is good. So the good. Incidence of mortality, morbidity, and health are reduced by using CPAP. The bad, weight may not change very much. But you'll feel better, you'll sleep better, you'll have more energy, and you'll have all the benefits. This is a tracing from a sleep study. Sympathetic nervous activity, I think in this one they actually did muscle, they put an electrode on and saw how the muscles were moving. This is respiration, so this is breathing normally, and then this is not breathing. Breathing normally, not breathing. And so each episode here is obstructive sleep apnea. And what you see is during breathing, this was calm. During apnea, these muscle fibers are firing very fast. And blood pressure goes up at the end of your sleep apnea each time. Not good. Let's change gears. Restless leg syndrome. Restless leg syndrome, I've known about even before I really knew about it. My grandfather, who's now passed, had restless leg syndrome. And we talk about it at night. He'd talk about his legs kicking almost like a bicycle. And we'd be out and there's an itchy sensation. We'll talk about all the details. An itchy sensation. We'd be out to a dinner. And he'd say, my legs are itching again. And he'd have to walk around the restaurant a few times. He'd come and sit down. It does run in families. And there are other people in my family that have restless leg syndrome. Luckily, it didn't hit me. So I've been aware of this for a long time. It's a neurologic movement disorder with an irresistible urge to move your legs. It has this thing called periodic leg movements of sleep. It happened in about 80%. Most of the people we diagnose with it have that form of it. These motions last a half a second to a second. And they happen not continuously. They happen, and then there's about 5 to a minute and a half. They don't do any, and then they move again and so forth. A lot of people I ask, do you kick the blanket off? If you're kicking the blanket off in the middle of the night and you're the only one sleeping in the bed, you probably have this. And then you usually flex at the knee and the hip, and you dorsiflex at the ankle. So it's this kind of movement, and it's almost like a bicycle movement while you're in your bed. Disagreeable sensations. So people don't like this. It's not a good feeling, and it usually happens with less activity. So at nighttime when you're laying there, more likely. When you're sitting down, more likely. It interferes with sleep. 2 to 15% of the population, so this is pretty common. And it has probably a genetic origin and does run in families, for sure. We don't have a gene that we can test for it, but it definitely runs in families. Urge to move the legs, usually but not always accompanied by uncomfortable and unpleasant sensations. It happens during periods of inactivity, such as lying or sitting. It is unpleasant, and when you move, it often takes these sensations away. More often during the night or times when you're sitting. Positive response is supportive things. There's a positive response to the medical treatment. Periodic limb movements, the ones that we talked about, the moving, and then a family history. You have to make sure it's not something else when we talk about restless leg syndrome. So iron deficiency runs very, very often with restless leg syndrome. There's a measure of iron deficiency called ferritin, and if it's less than 50, it's suggestive with these things. Severe iron deficiency is with a 6-fold increase, or 6 times increase in restless leg syndrome. If you have neurologic lesions of your spine or peripherally, you have to make sure it's not that, or it's not from that. That you're not pregnant, because it's seen a lot of times in pregnancy. and that again may go along with iron. Uremia, so end-stage renal disease. If you have end-stage renal disease, your dialysis, your uremic levels go up. And then certain medicines. SSRIs are on the list, lithium is on the list, dopamine antagonists that we'll talk about, and caffeine does make it worse. And tricyclic antidepressants. You have to make sure it's not just nighttime leg cramps. Nighttime leg cramps are painful. They're muscle contractions that happen, often focal, often not unilateral, sudden onset. Akathisia is a side effect from certain medications, dopamine medicines, the ones they call the antipsychotic medications, much more common. A peripheral neuropathy that can happen with diabetes or sometimes idiopathically, or vascular disease like having deep venous thrombosis or blood clots in the legs. You want to make sure it's none of these things before you can call it restless leg syndrome. When your doctor's examining you, they want to do a good neurologic exam looking for these things, especially the spinal cord and peripheral nerves. A vascular exam to rule out any blood clots and things like that. And then there's blood tests. I'm going to talk about blood tests on a future slide. So what's wrong? Why does this happen? We think if the brain is actually not getting enough iron. In medicine, we talk about something called the substantia nigra. It's a part of the brain. Most people know about that in Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's has too much iron in this area of the brain, and this is actually not enough iron in this. And they're both movement disorders. So that part of the substantia nigra is a part of the brain dealing with movement. Ferritin is one of the blood tests that we do to measure the amount of iron in the body. It's a storage form. There are other reasons that this can go up or down. Infection, inflammation, acute phase reactant, so if you've been very sick, and it can be up for 4 or 5 weeks. So if you get the flu or you get something like that, that's not the time to check this test. It changes with age, it changes with your kidney function also, so you have to check those. Iron homeostasis, which means the body and the way we absorb iron is very, very tightly regulated. So it isn't just I can send you home with iron all the time. And so if your ferritin is less than 10, which means you're iron deficient, you're going to absorb about 20% of the iron that you take in orally each day. That's a pretty good amount. But if it goes up to 50 to 75, you're only going to absorb 1 to 2% of it. And you really may need to get your serum ferritin over 200, which you're not going to get by that, to increase the actual brain iron. What's the side effect to taking iron? Constipation, absolutely. And so if you're only getting 1 to 2%, you're going to be taking it for 16 years before you have enough iron. So the amount, when you can dose it, iron sulfate, 325 milligrams, with vitamin C that helps its absorption. If your ferritin is less than 75, if it's more than 75, you need to do it IV. It's hard to see from back there, but this is an algorithm that you can follow through to see how you treat restless leg. At the top, it talks about, do you have the 4 core features of restless leg? Make sure it's nothing else that it's mimicking. And then you do blood tests, a serum ferritin and some iron studies. And if they are low and your serum ferritin is greater than 75, you can give regular oral iron. You do it for about 12 weeks and you assess how people are doing. If you can't give oral iron or they're not seeing the benefit, then you can go down the intravenous iron pathway. This is a whole intravenous iron. We don't need to go through this particular slide. So how do people treat it? Besides iron, medical therapy, and there's at least 4 drugs that we'll talk about that are approved and several drugs that are not approved that are also used. So ropinirole is called Requip. You guys have heard of that one? It's approved in 2005 for restless leg syndrome. You see improvement in about a week, which is pretty good if you've had this thing for years. Side effects, everything we do has some potential side effects. Nausea, fatigue, dizziness, and headache. You start with 1/4 milligram and build up to 1 to 5. The problem with many of these medicines are twofold. Some of them we lose benefit, so about 13% of them, people lost the benefit of the medicine after a while, and 4% of people saw augmentation. So the restless leg actually got a little worse with the treatment, but 96% obviously did not. Miropax, another very, very common medicine used for this, approved the next year after the other one, so 2006. Augmentation was seen in more of them, 9.2, but actually up to 42% after you had been on it for 8 years. Some people got sleepy. This is a bad one. 10% of people developed impulse control disorders, and others needed, other meds to help it work. This one's a patch, Nupro, dose 1 to 3 milligrams for 5 years, but 50% of people stopped it because it wasn't working. 13% of people had significant augmentation, but only 4% of them stopped it. So overall, it was more effective than the others. And side effects were much less because it was only local from the patch that you were putting on. Other medicines, carbidopa, levodopa. This is a movement disorder, so that's actually was a Parkinson's disease drug. And that was years ago before these other ones came out. That was what we used as one of the potential things. But a lot of augmentation, a lot of people not getting the benefit, getting worse with it. Gabapentin has no augmentation, but in the world that we live in here, weight gain. So we don't want that. Gabapentin or Horizons, another one that's directly FDA approved, 300 milligrams in the evening, no augmentation seen. That's a good one. But some somnolence and dizziness, other side effects. Opioids, so pain medicines, Percocets, Vicodins, and things like that. Methadone has been used for this. Clonazepam, which is in the Valium family. Carbamazepine, valproic acid, and clonidine, all again potentially used for this. A lot of people who have it and have another reason to take one of these medicines, they can just take one of those instead, or they tolerate them better than some of the others. Third part of our talk. Now we're going to start talking about things that we can do for sleep. So first, if we think we have insomnia, let's put a definition behind it. Yes, I'm having trouble falling asleep. I think it's insomnia. Lie in bed for 30 minutes or more, 3 times a week for a month. That is the definition of insomnia, or more often. Short-term or chronic, and the leading cause of insomnia in women is anxiety. We wake up in the middle of the night thinking about stuff that we can't get out of our brain. So let's talk about sleep hygiene. It's one of the things I talk about, pieces of this all the time in the office. These are things you can do that are non-medicinal, that have been shown for a lot of people to help them with sleep. The first one is light. Avoiding blue light especially. Blue light comes from screens all the time. If you have an eye product, so an Apple product, not the computer, but iPad, iPhone, there is something called night shift that you can turn on. There is a time you can turn it on from sundown to sunrise, and it knows where you are and such, so it'll do all this for you. It puts a little orange tint into your screen, which isn't making it orange, it's actually taking the blue light out. Blue light turns off melatonin, and that's why we want to avoid that. On other regular computers, so Apple's or PC, there's f.lux. If you Google that, it's an app that does the exact same thing. It's free and you can load it on any of your computers. It asks you what time zone you're in, and you tell it, and then it does it again all for you. You don't have to think about it. Clocks. You wake up at 2 in the morning, and what do you first do? You look to see what time it is. And then you go, well, I only have 2 hours of sleep anyway, or 3 hours of sleep, and you can't fall back asleep. They've even said the light that comes out of the clock, even those little red numbers, if that's what you're using, are too bright. And so the recommendation is either get it out of your room, turn it towards the wall, or what I used to do is when I had a clock is you put a little towel over it. If you really want to look at it, you lift it up and look at it, but it isn't staring at you. You don't know. So if you wake up and you don't know if it's 11 o'clock where you easily go back to sleep, or it's 2:30 and you're like, yeah, I have a little trouble. Don't look. Number 3, temperature. The optimal temperature for sleeping is somewhere between 60 and 67 degrees. Hard to get in the summer months here in Arizona, but fans and air conditioning, obviously, not so hard, not so bad. Sounds. If you're in a new place, you're in a new hotel room and there's different sounds, our body reacts to that. If someone is snoring in the bed next to you, we react to that also. If you have pets and other things. So noise machines or something like that do work very well for that, so that you always have a certain sound that your body gets used to knowing is sleep time. Scents, if there is any scent that helps with sleep, it's probably lavender. It hasn't been studied, but it is definitely out in the literature that if you're gonna try anything, that one may help us with sleep. Cut off caffeine, but I always talk about 2 in the afternoon, especially if you go to bed around 10. If you go to bed much later than that, use 4 in the afternoon because caffeine interferes with sleep. Avoid alcohol, especially before bed. We fall asleep better with alcohol. We don't stay asleep better. What it's doing is suppressing our REM sleep. So that's why people wake up much 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. You're waking up every hour, hour and a half after that drink earlier in the evening. Night showers or baths. So basically you're doing something that's heating up your body, and then it's the cooling off process that helps us fall asleep. So a hot shower, a hot bath, a hot drink that doesn't have calories in it, another good one. You know, they used to talk about warm milk and things like that. Meditate. You know, taking those crazy brain thoughts and being able to turn them off. When we go to the gym, we work out this muscle, and when we meditate, we work out that muscle. And there's a lot of apps that are really good for that now. And you can start out with just a little bit. Meditation is almost like what we talk, gardening. You have to keep watering and watering and watering and watering, and you don't get your plant until months and potentially years later. And meditation, you get your benefits over time. Routine to wind down at the end of the day. So I ask a lot of people, set an alarm. You keep missing, you should go to bed at 10 o'clock, but by the time you look at the clock, it's 11:30. Well, let's set an alarm to go to sleep, not just to wake up. And then you give yourself either 30 minutes or 60 minutes. Take that time and divide it into 3 sections. The first section, anything I have to finish for today. Load the dishwasher, things like that. What do I have to do for tomorrow? For me in my house, let's get my son's lunch ready or something like that. If something has to go to the office, it ends up in my car or I forget it at home. So that's when I do those kind of things. And then the third section is self-care. You brush your teeth, you take your medicines, you start your sleeping process. And if we set an alarm for it, it tells us when we should do that because we stop Netflixing or whatever we're doing at that time. There's a process called, basically you're tricking yourself. You're actually saying, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. And you're focusing on that, and you actually just drift off. It's written up in the literature as being an effective tool. I use an app called Pizziz. I've told many of you guys about that. It's available on all the devices that we have. It is an app, and it's a soundtrack for sleep. And I put on an old iPod, and I listen to it's always in one ear. The other ear's against the pillow to block out all the other sound. And this is what I've been doing for easily over 5 years. And then there's another guy. He's a hypnotist named Rick Collingwood, and I actually use that one to go back to sleep if I happen to wake up. And he has a weight loss hypnosis. I got it on Amazon as a download years ago. But I'm a cyclist, and he has one for being a better cyclist. So he's giving you little subliminal thoughts about that kind of stuff. There's for smoking cessation. He has a whole series of them. He's Australian, has a good accent. It puts me to sleep all the time. And if I happen to wake up in the middle of the night, I just start it up again. And my body knows when I hear either of those two things, it's time to go to sleep. Because it's been, again, if I said 5 years, I'm probably downplaying it by 2 or 3. And then progressive relaxation. Start at the head, tense your neck, tense your shoulders, tense your arms, working, but slowly all the way down, and take about a minute to a minute and a half to go through that. And then if it doesn't work, you do it again. And slowly but surely do that. Melatonin, a hormone that I talk about a fair amount. It comes from the pineal gland. It's about the size of a grape, the back of our brain. We all have melatonin. It is our sleep hormone. At wake, during the normal part of the day, it's very light. You only have about 1 picogram per milliliter, very low amount. At 15 hours later, it increases to 10. About 2 hours before we go to sleep, it's rising, starting to get our bodies ready to go to sleep. It rises at its peak to 60 to 70 at about 3 in the morning. In the morning, when we see daylight, it brings our melatonin back down. That's why getting dark in the evening, light in the morning. I tell a lot of people who I think that they have a melatonin thing, sit in your kitchen facing the windows in the morning for about 15 minutes. Be outside, go for a walk outside without sunglasses for about 15 minutes and get that light in to turn off your melatonin. Melatonin works on 2 parts of our body that work on sleep. So the first part, and it's called a weak hypnotic. So hypnotics are medicines that put you to sleep or work directly on the sleep process. It works on a system called the adenosine system. When we wake up in the morning, adenosine is low, and the longer you stay awake, the higher adenosine gets. If you woke up at 7 in the morning, you try to go to bed at 9 in the morning, your adenosine is really low. It's really hard to fall asleep 2 hours later. You stay up for 24 hours, you can probably fall asleep. Your adenosine's high enough, you can probably fall asleep standing up almost. Stay up for 48 hours, and you're falling asleep, micro-sleeping all the time. Taking a nap at the wrong part of the day, you took a nap at 5 p.m. and you're going to go to bed at 10, it brings your adenosine levels down just enough so that when you try to go to sleep later, they're not high enough. And so it doesn't work. Melatonin does not work very well on that system. But what it does work very good on is a chronobiotic. What it's doing is helping reset your internal clock to tell you that it is bedtime. So some people say, I should go to bed at 10 o'clock, but I'm never tired at 10 o'clock. We start using melatonin and we start using it, and I think on the next slide about when we should start using it, but it's actually not at bedtime. It's much before that. So what's the right dose? If you go to the grocery store, you see 1s, you see 3s, 5s, 10s. But the right dose at the blood level is 0.3 milligrams. At the oral level is probably only 1 to 3 milligrams. Or we're taking way, way, way too much of it. Because as we talked about, it was picograms were the actual dose that we had in our body. Best time to take it for resetting your clock, 9 hours after you get up or 7 hours before sleep. Telling your body. So especially if you travel, across time zones, you can use this to help you get reset on the new time zone, especially if you're going over oceans. So more time zones away. How much light does it take, or what wavelength of light does it take to suppress melatonin? Blue light in the 440 to 460. You can actually buy, and I did buy a pair. I've only worn them twice, so I can't tell you that they work. But these orange, like blue blocker sunglasses that you wear around your house in the evening. I had all these ideas of wearing them, and I actually haven't. They sit on my nightstand. So I was going to try it out, but you can buy those very inexpensively. I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but this is a whole chart put out by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and it's what to do with medicines for sleep. And 14 of them were listed, and just to talk about them, Belsomra is a new prescription in the last couple of years for sleep. Lunesta, a lot of us have heard of. It's a very common one. Sonata is very short acting, so it helps you fall asleep, but doesn't help you stay asleep. Ambien, the one that's been out forever. Yeah. We do know that Ambien, especially, and Lunesta, in some people, so you have to be very careful. They during the night they do things, and eating is one of them. Back when I first heard about this, I actually didn't believe it. I had a patient before I started doing weight, and he walked into my office at 10 minutes to 8 for a sick visit, and he had a big burn on his arm. And he came in with his wife, and I said, what happened? And his wife goes, every time he takes his Ambien, he cooks bacon at 3 in the morning. And he got grease spilled on his arm that night, and we treated him for second-degree burns. And we worked to get him off his Ambien. Triazolam, temazepam are in the Valium family. Rosarum, another one, and doxepin. Now it's interesting, they say ones you should not use. Very commonly used, trazodone, one we even use here. Diphenhydramine, what is that? Benadryl. And there is a weight gaining property to Benadryl, so you do have to be careful with that one. So what they're saying is for chronic use. Occasionally you have to use a Benadryl here and there, go for it. But as for everyday use, we probably have better medicines for it. Melatonin for sleep onset. So they're saying as we talked about, that process S, it's only weak. For resetting the chronotrope, it was very good. Valerian, some people use, they're not recommending, and then tryptophan.
How many of those at the top are not addictive, but you have to rely on them in order to sleep?
The majority of them. And that is one of the reasons they're avoiding and trying to avoid some of these medicines. I believe you should work on sleep hygiene first. If you get to a point where you're just still not sleeping, you do need to consider these, because it's better to be, addicted to a medicine that's only helping you sleep, as long as you're not having the nighttime. So they go through, eating is one of them. Back when I was asking questions, I had over 100 people. Once I got up to about 100, I stopped counting. I've had people drive their car in their sleep. Someone pulled their car into the driveway because they forgot to pull it in and went into the cabinets. And in the morning, she said to her husband, who pulled my car in the garage? And he said, you did. In the last 6 months, I had someone cleaning their chandelier over their dining room table, which they said they would have never done beyond that. People ordering, one of the first people ordered when Amazon was new. She knew all of her stuff to get in. It wasn't the one-click ordering. She ordered 10 of the same book and was too embarrassed to send it back. I know people Facebook, they instant message, they do all that kind of stuff in their sleep. I think infomercials probably are only around so that people buy things in their sleep. That's my guess.
Can I ask one more question?
Absolutely.
Why not Benadryl?
For me, it's because of the weight gaining properties. It's an H1 blocker, they call it, and that system works a little bit on appetite. And the fatigue that some people get, the hangover that they get, will cause you to want to use carbs more to bring up your energy if you're hungover from it. But again, episodic use, we've never, you need it once here and there, go for it. Every night, we probably should find something else.
What about the Zolpidem? I've been told that, and the Lunesta
Yes,
Alzheimer's research.
I have not seen it. I can't really comment on it.
Okay.
I've heard buzz, but
Yeah.
they're still on the market. If they truly were causing it, they'd come off the market. That's my belief.
Okay. I like
I'm simple. Last couple of slides. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, the CDC recommends 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night. So how do you get 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night? If the average person's sleep efficiency is about 90%, the time you lay in bed, including waking up. Waking up for the bathroom, that we go through 90-minute sleep cycles. To get 8 hours, you need 8.5 hours in sleep in bed. And to get 8 hours, you need 7 hours, to get 7 hours and 12 minutes, you need to be in bed for 8 hours. So we can't just, get in bed at 9 and get out of bed at 4 and say we've had all the sleep we need. We need a little more than that because of some of the inefficiencies. And if you're drinking the amount of water that I ask you to drink, you're waking up, 1, 2, or 3 times a night anyway, hopefully going right back to sleep. And last but not least, a quote from one of the studies: sleep is the most sedentary activity, yet maybe our only sedentary activity that protects you from weight gain and improves your health. Thanks. Questions? Go ahead.
I've been doing my Fitbit that talks about like deep sleep and REM sleep, and so I started doing some research and I was reading that like deep sleep is better than REM. Like what actually is like?
So sleep goes through, there's phase 1, 2, 3, 4 REM sleep. And it goes through a 90-minute cycle. And you need all of them, truthfully. So you need light sleep, you need deep sleep, and you need REM sleep. If you're not getting as much deep sleep, then something is interfering you from getting into that deep sleep. Whether it's movements, whether it's snoring in the same bed, whatever it is, or something.
So you can achieve REM sleep several times during the night?
Yes.
Oh.
And so another part about getting short sleep, so 5 or 6 hours, if it goes by 90-minute cycles and you have more REM sleep in the later parts of night, so if you take 90 minutes, 90 minutes, 90 minutes, at 5 or 6 hours, you're missing a whole cycle of sleep. And so when people say, I tend to wake up at 3 in the morning, it's because probably for their timing, it happens to be at a top where they're in a light stage of sleep. And so then you notice your bladder is full, so you wake up and I say, then reset. For me, it's always on the right side with that little earbud in. I actually, personally, again, I sleep with a sleep mask even in the dark room that I'm in. I just got used to it a couple of years ago when there was a time where it wasn't dark. And so that sensation, again, and so I am super programmed when it comes to sleep. Yes?
With the CPAP machine, how long should it take for you to fall asleep on average using that machine?
So it's going to be different for every person. The newer machines start out the pressure very low to allow you to comfortably or more comfortably fall asleep. And then over the next half an hour to an hour, ramp up the pressure to where it should be. More often it's someone whose mask or such doesn't fit them correctly or is not comfortable. And I've had many, many, many people have to do 5 and 6 and 7 different masks before they found the one that was comfortable enough to then fall asleep. But to say we don't have insomnia, we want to not lay there for more than a half an hour. And so hopefully less than a half an hour.
Once you get used to it, you just whap it on, right into a coma.
2 hours, and I throw the thing across the room and say, that's it, I'm not doing it any longer.
So you may benefit from one of the medicines that were on the list to help induce sleep.
One back.
Yeah.
What about naps? You never discussed naps.
So I think naps are a mixed piece. If you can nap and still go to sleep at your normal time, I think naps are good. I think for most people, we nap too long when we nap, and the average nap should be 20 or 30 minutes, just to take the edge off of that, and then go right back to what you're doing. So again, with that Pazizz app, there's 2 modes. There's a sleep mode and a nap mode. And in the nap mode, you can set it for 20 and 30 minutes, and it actually wakes you up. Over years now, when I'm a napper, I have never overslept from that thing. And there's a guy's voice, and he talks for a few minutes, and then it gets quiet. And then right before it goes, now wake up and have a great day. And I can tell you, he talks for 6 minutes, and I've listened to it 1,000 or more times. I still don't know what he says. It's just so subtle and so forth. I did have someone I knew who called him creepy, but I still think the app is great. So yeah, napping, as long as it isn't interfering with sleep. The earlier, kind of in the afternoon, the better. You know, the 1:30, 2 o'clock, as opposed to the 4 o'clock for sure, always better. If you're not getting it at night, hopefully you can get a little nap to catch up, you know, during the day a little bit. A study just came out. The 5 doctors in the practice, we get together once about every month, 6 weeks, and we do a little journal club, so everyone prepares an article. We just had one last night, and Dr. de Guzman did one on sleep, and it talked about how you cannot catch up on sleep on the weekends. We've talked about it. It's gone back and forth and back and forth. It isn't that if you just miss for one night and then one weekend and you catch up on the weekend and then you go back to sleeping normally. It was really when you lost sleep during the week, you caught up on the weekend, and then went back into losing sleep on the next week. That was when you had the detriment.
That messes up your sleep hygiene.
It does mess up your sleep hygiene. It messes up your internal clock of when you should be sleeping and not. And so I didn't talk about it, but I guess the time you go to sleep should, as close as possible, be within the same hour, 7 days a week. Weekends and weekdays. There's this thing called social jet lag, which is when you stay up extra late on a Friday and Saturday, and then Sunday night comes and you're trying to get to sleep to go to work on Monday, and you can't fall asleep. It's not jet lag because we've flown, it's jet lag because we're not keeping and listening to our internal systems. Caffeine works on that adenosine system, and that's why caffeine is our world's most used drug. Yes?
So if you're up by 5 or 6 every morning, are you in bed usually by 9 or 10?
I am asleep before 10 o'clock 100% of the time, and I'm probably in bed by 9:30, 9:20, 9:15. On a perfect night, it's asleep by 9:30, 9:35. Yeah, because I'm up at 10 to 5 or 5, almost 7 days a week. It works for me. Doesn't work for everybody. Other questions?
Well, when do you get your nap?
I slept for 15 minutes right before I came here.
Had a little power nap.
Yeah. We started at 6 this morning, so I went home and took a very short one. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.